I never had any intention of telling this story. I never had any intention of telling this story. It just never crossed my mind to tell a story. It's just one of those things that happened to me. And I didn't think too much more about it. But telling this story to a family member some months ago, her response was quite interesting. She was, moved by the story and felt it was a compassionate story. So I thought, well, perhaps others could benefit from the story. Now, to tell the story, I have to go back a little bit, otherwise the story won't make much sense. So the first 7 years were spent with my mother, and then the next 8 years of my childhood were spent in a children's home with my older brother. He and I were there for about 8 years. So we didn't have too much to do with our mother. We would see her occasionally, but we didn't have a lot of contact. But when I left the orphanage, I rented a room. Yes, it was only a room, one room, near my mother, because I suppose that's the thing you do. You want to be near your mother. And I would go to her 2-room flat most days, because she had more room than I had in my 1 room. But the problem was that being an alcoholic really didn't work very well for me. I found that intolerable. I did my best, but I just couldn't live with that at all. She was drinking daily, and her lifestyle was not conducive with being a good mother. It never had been. And the arguments and the conflicts just never ended. They never ceased. And so I decided that I needed to get away, go and lead my own life. So I moved away and eventually, started to buy my own property, and then moved up a little and a little, as we do. And I hadn't seen my mother for many years. And one day I received a phone call from my sister saying that she's in hospital with cancer. So I go and visit her and walked into the ward and remember being really surprised by, her condition. I didn't expect it to be as bad as it was. So I sat down beside the bed and we didn't say very much. I think she was pleased that I was there, but we didn't speak very much. And at some point, she said, "How are you?" That was it. What are you doing now? Not much more than that. I said, "Yes, I'm fine. Everything's moving nicely." And one of the doctors was doing the rounds, and he came over to her bed, started looking at her notes. So I thought I would grab that opportunity to have a word with him. And I asked him what the situation was, and he said, "Well, yes, it's just a matter of time. However, the thing that they can't understand is why she's so tenacious and determined to fight, the final verdict, as it were, end of life." He said, "We see it from time to time, but this is pretty out there, pretty kind of determined." And as I was driving home, I gave this some thought. I thought, okay, I think I know the reason. Being brought up in a strong religion where you were constantly told that, you had to fear God, you had to atone for your sins. And she followed that rule, that you would have to meet your God and he would judge you. I personally don't feel if there's any God out there, whatever that God is going to judge you. God is going to be compassionate, but that was the religious doctrine. And so she would have had no problem believing this and fearing the final day when she ended this life and moved on to the next life. And so I decided that what I would do is go back to the hospital the following morning early, before anybody else arrived. So I arrived early, nobody there, so that was achieved. And I sat beside her bed and she looked at me, and you had a sense, although she didn't say anything, that she was pleased to see me. And I just sat there for about 10 minutes, not saying very much at all, except the usual, how are you you comfortable? Well, at some point I thought, right, okay, I'm going to ask her if she's worried about anything. I said to her very quietly, because there are other patients in other beds, is there anything worrying you? Anything bothering you? And she looked at me and said, no. And she looked away. And about 10-ish seconds later, I asked her the same question. Is there anything bothering you? And again, she looked at me with that pause, looking at me, and then saying, no. And I said to her, there is no reason to worry. All has been forgiven. Nothing to concern yourself with. And she just laid back on the bed, resting her head on her pillow. And I rather felt in thought. I stayed there 10 minutes, maybe. Then I got up to go. And she said, don't go. Which was something my mother had never said to me in her life. I said, well, I've got to go because I have things to do, but I'll be back tomorrow. She died that night. And I'd like to think that I gave her permission, that it was okay to go, nothing to be remorseful for. That was just her life, and that's the way it was. Now, she was not just an alcoholic. She was the most incredible personality. She was kind. You know, she would spend time with people who needed her time. And the saying that she would give you her last penny was certainly true of my mother, and we didn't have many pennies in those days. But she would give people whatever they needed. Yes, it wasn't good for us as children, but that's just the way it is. So I remember those times with her. And I think I hope I learnt some of those things from her. The kindness was something that people would talk about a lot. And she was very funny, and she played the piano, and she could sing. Now, of course, when the alcohol took over, then it was a different story. However, we must now appreciate that we understand more and more about these addictions, and all addictions have a dopamine element. And people think, oh, well, they're wanting the high from the dopamine, but that's not strictly true. Dopamine has a natural tendency to want to balance, because again, it's to do with our survival. So dopamine responds to pleasurable experiences and painful experiences. And that's what helps us survive. So dopamine is constantly trying to balance. But that's a video for another day. But the reason for the video is because you may have been through something like this, or perhaps you may go through it at some point in the future. Now, if there's any conflict, any distancing from family members, now's the time to change those things. I do understand that sometimes it's the other side, it's the other party or the other parties. And it may not be easy to do that, because you have to have an understanding of how we function as human beings. And we have views, we have opinions, and those views and opinions and attitudes as well are based on our life experiences, how we formulated those thoughts and those beliefs and those attitudes in our heads. And they will not be the same as yours. I would like to hear your stories, so please you can post them underneath. I will read them all, because I'm fascinated with people's stories, always have been. And I just hope that this video will help somebody. Thank you so much for your time.